In February of 1965, a group of Chevrolet executives sat in a closed room in Detroit and made a decision they hoped the public would never fully understand. They were about to quietly kill off one of the most dangerous design flaws in the history of American cars, without ever admitting it was dangerous in the first place. No press release. No recall. No apology. Just a silent redesign, buried under marketing language about comfort and smoothness, while the real story stayed locked away for decades. And the car at the center of it all would go on to become the best-selling automobile nameplate in American history, a record that still stands today, 6 decades later. This is the story Chevrolet never wanted told the way it actually happened, and by the end of this video you will understand why some car experts still call the 1965 Impala the most quietly covered-up success story in Detroit history. For 7 straight years before 1965, every full-size Chevrolet, including every single Impala, was built on something called an X-frame chassis. Picture the frame of a car like a ladder running underneath it. 2 long rails connected by crossbars, giving the whole structure strength along its entire length. Now imagine pinching that ladder inward in the middle. So instead of running straight and strong from the front bumper to the back bumper, it narrows dramatically, almost like an hourglass. That was the X-frame. It looked clever on paper. It let engineers drop the floor lower, which made the car feel sleeker, and let stylists design a lower, longer silhouette that buyers loved. But here is what almost nobody outside of Chevrolet's own engineering department really understood at the time. Take away the side rails running the full length of the car, and you take away the one thing standing between a passenger and a T-bone collision. If another vehicle hit a Chevrolet built on that X-frame from the side, there was almost nothing structural to absorb the impact before it reached the passenger compartment. Safety researchers were starting to raise alarms, insurance data was starting to show patterns, and Chevrolet knew. So what did they do? They didn't hold a press conference admitting the frame was a liability. Instead, for the 1965 model year, they replaced the entire chassis with something called a full perimeter frame, a design that ran unbroken and uninterrupted from the front of the car to the rear, exactly like the ladder was supposed to look before anyone got clever with it. And then, instead of telling the public the truth, that the old frame had been a serious side impact risk for 7 consecutive years, Chevrolet's marketing department gave the new frame a name that sounded like nothing more than a comfort upgrade. They called it the safety girder frame, and they folded it into advertising about a smoother, quieter ride. Comfort. That was the word they wanted you thinking about. Not the fact that hundreds of thousands of Americans had been driving around for the better part of a decade in cars that offered almost no side impact protection at all. The 1965 Impala rode on a completely new skeleton, engineered specifically to correct a problem nobody at Chevrolet wanted to say out loud, and it worked so well that most buyers never once thought to ask why the ride suddenly felt so different. But that cover-up is only the beginning, because the frame wasn't the only secret buried inside that car's design. The body sitting on top of that new frame had its own strange and hidden history. When General Motors' board of directors sat down to approve the styling direction for the entire 1965 full-size lineup, they had already signed off on a completely different design. It was finished. It was settled business. Somewhere in a Detroit design studio, a team led by a stylist named Irv Rybicki looked at that approved design, looked at each other, and quietly decided to keep working anyway. They came back to the board with something nobody had asked for and nobody had approved: sweeping curved glass along the sides, a pronounced curve over the rear wheels that echoed the shape of a Coca-Cola bottle, a front end that leaned forward like the car was already in motion while parked. By every normal rule of how a massive corporation like General Motors operated, that unauthorized design should have been thrown in the trash. Somehow, against every institutional instinct, it got approved instead, and it replaced the design the board had already signed off on. The result became one of the most celebrated body designs in the history of American automobiles, a shape so influential that it defined what a full-size American car was supposed to look like for the rest of the decade. Now here is where the story gets even stranger, because that celebrated curved glass very nearly never made it into production at all, for reasons that had nothing to do with corporate politics and everything to do with physics. Glassmakers looked at Rybicki's design and told Chevrolet's engineers, flatly, that what they were asking for could not be manufactured at the volume a mass-market car required. Curving a sheet of glass in one direction is difficult enough. curving it in two directions simultaneously. What engineers call compound curvature was considered close to impossible to produce consistently and affordably at the scale of a car selling in the hundreds of thousands. Early manufacturing attempts failed at an alarming rate. The tooling costs were enormous. Every instinct in a cost-conscious corporation like General Motors should have said scrap the curved glass and go back to flat panels like every other car on the road. Instead, Chevrolet pushed forward anyway, quietly eating the cost and the failure rate, because someone inside that company understood something the accountants didn't want to hear, that without the curved glass, the entire Coke bottle shape of the body would look broken, disconnected, wrong. They gambled an enormous amount of money on glass that experts said could not be made, and when the cars rolled into showrooms, that curved glass became one of the very first details buyers noticed and fell in love with. While all of this was happening beneath the surface, something even bigger was quietly unfolding under the hood, and this is where the story turns almost into a corporate soap opera. The car that rolled off the assembly line in the fall of 1964 was, in almost every meaningful way, a completely different vehicle from the one that rolled off that same assembly line just a few months later. The early cars carried a big block engine called the 409, an engine that had been turned into a genuine piece of American pop culture, celebrated in a hit song, worshipped on drag strips, a name that alone could sell cars. And yet, behind the scenes, Chevrolet's own engineers already knew the 409 was dying. It was built on an architecture that dated back to truck engines from the late 1950s, with a combustion chamber design that made it struggle to breathe efficiently at high speeds. Ford and Chrysler had already leapfrogged past it with more modern designs, and it showed on the racetrack in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. So in January of 1965, in the middle of the model year, without any announcement that would draw attention to what was really happening, Chevrolet quietly swapped in a brand new engine, the 396, alongside a brand new carburetor that would go on to become one of the most widely used performance carburetors in American automotive history. They killed off a cultural icon in the middle of its own production run and replaced it with its successor before most customers even realized the old engine was gone. Fewer than 3,000 of those original 409 engines ever made it into a 1965 Impala before it disappeared for good, and today, a car with that engine still under its hood, never swapped, never replaced, is treated by collectors the way art dealers treat a lost painting suddenly found in an attic. At the exact same moment Chevrolet was making that quiet engine swap, they were also making another move that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with money, and it was a direct, almost panicked response to a rival automaker's success. Ford had just launched a plush, wood-trimmed, whisper-quiet version of one of its own full-size cars, and it was selling extremely well, eating into territory Chevrolet considered its own. Chevrolet's answer arrived that same February, folded quietly into the Impala lineup as an option package rather than announced as some brand new model, genuine wood veneer on the dashboard, button-tufted upholstery, a smoother ride, spinner wheel covers with a small emblem in the center. For a little over $200 on top of the base price, buyers could turn an ordinary Impala into something that felt like it belonged in a much higher price bracket. The response was so overwhelming that in the handful of months it was available, tens of thousands of buyers snapped it up, and General Motors made the decision almost immediately to spin it off into its own separate model line for the following year. What started as a quiet, almost defensive mid-year patch job became one of the most successful product moves in the company's history, and it happened so fast that most customers walking into a showroom in early 1965 had no idea they were witnessing the birth of an entirely new car line in real time. There is one more secret hiding in plain sight inside this car, and it might be the strangest one of all, because it involves a gauge that Chevrolet put directly in front of every single supersport buyer's eyes, and most of those buyers never understood what they were looking at. Standard on every 1965 Impala Supersport was a small instrument called a vacuum gauge, mounted right there on the dashboard where a driver would expect to see something dramatic, a tachometer screaming toward redline, an oil pressure needle jumping under hard acceleration. Instead, drivers got a quiet little needle that most of them assumed was decoration, something that looked technical without actually meaning anything to the average person behind the wheel. In reality, that gauge was reading something genuinely important, the vacuum created inside the engine's intake manifold, a number that rises and falls with exactly how hard the engine is working. A driver who understood how to read it could watch that needle and know, in real time, whether their engine was breathing efficiently, whether they were burning fuel wastefully at highway speed, whether something under the hood needed attention before it became an expensive problem. Chevrolet's own engineers knew that the big, thirsty engines available in the Supersport could drink fuel at an alarming rate if a driver wasn't paying attention, and they built in a quiet, honest warning system for anyone willing to learn what it meant. And almost nobody did. It sat there on hundreds of thousands of dashboards, a genuinely useful piece of engineering information, treated by most owners as nothing more than an interesting-looking dial they never bothered to decode. Put all of these pieces together, and a very different picture starts to emerge of what the 1965 Impala actually was. It wasn't just a pretty car that happened to sell well. It was a car built on top of a chassis that quietly corrected a safety problem Chevrolet never publicly admitted to. It wore a body that shouldn't have existed according to the company's own approval process. It used glass that experts said couldn't be manufactured. It carried an engine that was replaced mid-year in a move designed to draw as little attention as possible to the fact that a cultural icon was being retired. And it hid a genuinely useful piece of engineering inside a gauge that looked like an afterthought. None of that was an accident. Every single one of those decisions was made deliberately, by people inside Chevrolet who understood exactly what they were doing and chose, again and again, to let the results speak instead of the explanations. And the results did speak, louder than anyone at Chevrolet could have predicted. When the final production numbers came in for the 1965 model year, the total stood at just over 1 million cars, a number no single car nameplate in American history had ever reached before in a single model year, and none has reached since. Not the Mustang, which had launched to enormous fanfare the year before and still sold hundreds of thousands fewer units. Not any Impala that came after it, including the very next year's model, which, despite strong sales of its own, still fell noticeably short of that number. Every automaker in the world took notice. European manufacturers who had built their entire business strategies around the assumption that no single model could ever dominate at that scale were forced to rethink how they thought about mass production and platform economics. Inside General Motors, that number validated every uncomfortable, expensive, risky decision the team had made along the way. The costly glass tooling nobody was sure would work. The frame redesign nobody wanted to publicly explain. The mid-year engine swap that could have confused and alienated loyal customers if it had been handled clumsily. Instead, it all came together at exactly the right moment, and more than 1 million American families drove home in a car that carried far more hidden engineering, hidden history, and quiet corporate maneuvering than any of them ever realized while they were signing the paperwork. There is something almost poetic about how much of this story stayed hidden for so long. This wasn't a car with a scandal splashed across newspaper headlines. There was no dramatic recall, no congressional hearing, no whistleblower coming forward to expose what had really been happening inside Chevrolet's design studios and engineering departments. Instead, the truth simply sat there, buried under marketing copy about smooth rides and comfortable interiors, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough to actually dig into the engineering records, the internal memos, the production data. Most people who owned one of these cars, who drove it to work every day, who took their families on road trips in it, who eventually sold it or passed it down or let it rust away in a garage, never knew any of this. They just knew it was a good car. A great-looking car. A car that seemed to just work, without asking too many questions about why. But the truth is that this car worked as well as it did precisely because of everything Chevrolet chose not to advertise. Every quiet correction, every unauthorized design decision, every engineering gamble nobody was sure would pay off, every mid-year swap designed to slip past public notice, all of it stacked together into a machine that ended up defining an entire era of American car culture and set a sales record that has now survived for 6 decades without a single challenger coming close. Now stay with me here, because there is one more layer to this that most people never connect, and it might be the most revealing part of the entire cover-up. Ask yourself why a company that had just spent enormous amounts of money quietly fixing a dangerous chassis, quietly gambling on impossible glass, and quietly killing off a beloved engine, would then turn around and run 2 advertising campaigns that flatly contradicted each other. On one side of Chevrolet's 1965 marketing, every big block engine in the lineup carried a name meant to scream raw power, aggressive acceleration, a car that wanted to fight you every time you touched the throttle. On the other side, the entire full-size lineup was being sold under a completely different promise, one built entirely around silence, smoothness, and isolation from the outside world. The kind of ride where you were supposed to forget you were even sitting on top of an engine at all. Any marketing textbook would tell you that is a contradiction you cannot sell at the same time. A car cannot logically be both a snarling performance machine and a floating, whisper-quiet luxury cruiser. And yet Chevrolet ran both messages side by side in the same brochures, aimed at the same buyers, without ever once acknowledging the tension between them. Here is why that decision, which should have confused customers and split the brand in two directions, actually became one of the smartest moves the company ever made. American buyers in 1965 did not want to choose between power and comfort. They wanted both at the same time in the same car without compromise. And because of everything that had happened quietly behind the scenes, the new perimeter frame correcting the old chassis problem, the redesigned suspension sitting on top of it, Chevrolet's engineers had accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, built a car capable of delivering exactly that. The new frame's rigidity combined with a fully redesigned coil suspension at all four corners to produce a highway ride noticeably quieter and smoother than anything the old chassis had ever managed, while still housing engines built to embarrass much smaller, lighter cars off the line. The contradiction in the advertising turned out to be nothing more than an accurate description of an engineering reality nobody wanted to explain in plain language. And more than 1 million buyers, without ever hearing the real story behind why the car felt the way it did, voted with their wallets that they wanted exactly that combination. Think about what that really means for a moment. A company sat on a chassis flaw serious enough that safety researchers were raising alarms about it, and instead of admitting the danger publicly, buried the fix inside a comfort campaign. A design team broke the rules of their own corporate approval process, and was never publicly credited for pulling off one of the most celebrated body designs in automotive history. Engineers gambled enormous sums of money on glass that manufacturing experts said could not reliably be produced, and let the finished cars speak for themselves rather than bragging about the risk. A cultural icon of an engine was killed off mid-year with almost no fanfare, replaced so smoothly that most buyers never noticed the switch happened at all. And a marketing department ran two contradictory campaigns at once because they understood their customers better than their customers understood the car sitting in their own driveway. This is what makes the story of the 1965 Impala so different from almost every other car in American history that gets talked about the way this one does. Most legendary cars get remembered because of one obvious dramatic thing: a famous crash, a celebrity owner, a scene in a movie, a single spectacular number on a spec sheet. This car became legendary because of everything Chevrolet chose to keep quiet, stacked one on top of another, until the combined weight of all those hidden decisions produced a machine that simply worked better than anyone expected and sold in numbers nobody had ever seen before or has seen since. And if you think this kind of quiet, calculated silence stopped once the cars left the factory, it didn't. Because there is a second, completely different chapter to this story that most Impala fans never even hear about, one that took place thousands of miles away from Detroit, and it involves the exact same car being built with an entirely different identity hidden inside it. At the very same time, American factories were pumping out well over 1 million of these cars for domestic buyers. A much smaller, much quieter operation was underway at Chevrolet's Canadian facilities, building right-hand drive versions of the exact same car for export to markets like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. On the surface, that sounds like a simple business decision, nothing worth hiding. But look closer at how long that arrangement quietly continued, and the story gets stranger. Those export cars kept using a version of the 1965 dashboard all the way through the 1969 model year, 4 full years after American buyers had moved on to completely updated interior designs. Somewhere in Chevrolet's export division, a decision was made to keep manufacturing an outdated interior for international customers years after domestic buyers had left it behind. A quiet little secret of its own, hidden in plain sight in showrooms on the other side of the planet, where nobody back home was ever likely to notice or ask questions about it. Put all of these pieces together, the buried chassis flaw, the unauthorized design that overruled its own board of directors, the impossible glass nobody was supposed to be able to build, the engine swapped out mid-year before anyone could get too attached to what was disappearing, the contradictory marketing that turned out to be quietly true, and the export cars still wearing outdated interiors years after everyone else had moved on, and a very different picture starts to emerge of what the 1965 Impala actually was. It wasn't just a pretty car that happened to sell well. It was a company's careful, calculated silence, built into sheet metal, wrapped in chrome, and sold to more than 1 million American families who never once suspected how much they weren't being told. There is something almost poetic about how much of this story stayed hidden for so long. This wasn't a car with a scandal splashed across newspaper headlines. There was no dramatic recall, no congressional hearing, no whistleblower coming forward to expose what had really been happening inside Chevrolet's design studios and engineering departments. Instead, the truth simply sat there, buried under marketing copy about smooth rides and comfortable interiors, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough to actually dig into the engineering records, the internal memos, the production data. Most people who owned one of these cars, who drove it to work every day, who took their families on road trips in it, who eventually sold it or passed it down or let it rust away in a garage, never knew any of this. They just knew it was a good car. A great-looking car. A car that seemed to just work, without asking too many questions about why. But the truth is that this car worked as well as it did precisely because of everything Chevrolet chose not to advertise. Every quiet correction, every unauthorized design decision, every engineering gamble nobody was sure would pay off. Every mid-year swap designed to slip past public notice. Every export car quietly holding onto a design the home market had already discarded. All of it stacked together into a machine that ended up defining an entire era of American car culture and set a sales record that has now survived for 6 decades without a single challenger coming close. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. If a company could bury a safety flaw, override its own board's approved design, gamble on manufacturing experts telling them something was impossible, kill off a cultural icon mid-year without a single press release, run 2 contradictory ad campaigns at the same time, and quietly ship an outdated interior overseas for years after retiring it at home, and still come out the other side with the single best-selling car nameplate in American history. An unbroken record that has now survived through the muscle car era, the fuel crisis, the SUV boom, and every modern car launched since. What does that actually tell you about how much of the story behind any legendary car you think you already know is still sitting hidden in a filing cabinet somewhere in Detroit?